Okay, so I think we will go ahead and get rolling. Welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Bostic, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Extension Agent with the University of Florida in both Sarasota and DeSoto counties. I'm guessing that most of you are from the state of Florida. If anyone is not, those two counties are down on the southwest coast of Florida. And I am joined today with my wonderful coworker, Maria. Maria, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. I am Dr. Maria Portelos Ramito, and I am the Family and Consumer Sciences Agent, and I will be teaching the food safety portion of this evening's class. So welcome to everybody.
So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So what you see on your screen is about to change. And as I'm doing that, I'll just let you know that we probably will end up with a relatively large-ish group today. And usually the easiest way to go about asking questions is to have you just type your questions right there into the chat box. If you're unfamiliar with the chat box, there's a little icon that you should see. Let's see, hold on one sec. I'm not very good at talking and there we go. Talking and explaining and doing at the same time. But there's a little box that looks kind of like a text message symbol that you should see somewhere near the bottom right portion of your screen. You can actually type right into that box if you have questions. And if you're not comfortable with typing questions, I'll pause every once in a while, ask Maria if there are questions from that text box or that chat box. And if you'd prefer to ask your questions verbally at that point, just flag us and let us know, and you can unmute yourself. But generally it works better when we have larger groups if you are comfortable with typing into the chat box to do that. So here we go. I'm gonna dive right in. So this class is all about starting a prepared foods business at home. And it's a pretty exciting concept for a lot of people. And turns out it's a little more complicated on some levels than it seems like it might be. But there's also a huge amount of possibility in it. And it's something that we've been hearing more and more people be interested in as more and more people are working from home. So I'm going to spend the first hour and a half-ish of the class talking about some of the things that you just need to know about what is and isn't allowable under how the laws are written in Florida about producing in your own home. When Maria and I teach this class in person, it's very interactive. You touch things, you look at ingredient lists. So we're gonna do our best to make it interactive-ish via Zoom, where everyone has their microphones off. Not necessarily the most fun way, but I'm going to try to keep it flowing. So here we go. So most people in Florida have never heard of this thing called the Florida Cottage Food Law, but it's actually a law that's been around for 10 years. And just 4 years ago or 3 years ago, it was actually amended. And so what that law allows is that it allows folks who live in Florida to prepare and sell up to $50,000 worth of certain food products in their own unlicensed home kitchen. That's pretty amazing. Not every state has a cottage food law. Some have a much lower limit to how much you can sell in a year. So that's the very, very, very basics of the cottage food law. And you will see there on your screen, it says there's some big caveats. And that is because there are some big caveats to this simple sounding sentence. So I really want to start by making sure that, that you know some of your options. So that's a whole lot of words on your screen. You don't need to read all these words. And let me back up one second too. All of the, my whole PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to also send out to folks as a PDF. So via email, probably tomorrow or Friday. So you'll have all of this information. You can actually read through the slides again. So FDACS, that first big word that you see on your screen, FDACS, that stands for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. That's a branch of our state government that they regulate many different things, including the making and selling of food in Florida. So you can see on this list over here on the left side of your screen, you should be able to see my little pointer arrow. Right there on the list is Cottage Foods. So we'll go into what Cottage Foods are in just a moment, but Cottage Foods is basically one and the same as the kinds of foods you are allowed to make in your own home. And you can see that this is the whole list of food establishments and food production in Florida that the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services regulates. So Cottage Foods is just one of many different kinds of ways you could theoretically be producing and selling food in Florida. So in the process of learning more about cottage foods, one thing that becomes really clear to some people very quickly is that what you want to produce and sell actually doesn't fit under the cottage foods law. It may actually fit better under something like a mobile food vendor license, production in a commercial kitchen, something like through the retail food program. So if you have a really good idea in your head and it doesn't quite seem to fit, just know that you might not be able to make it in your own home, but there's other options for places that you can make and sell your food. So we're really specifically going to talk about the cottage food law, aka the stuff you can actually legally produce and sell out of your own home. So I promise this is going to get less dry in a moment, but we do have to start with some definitions because after all, this is a state statute. It's a law. And so, laws don't tend to be written for excitement's sake. They tend to be pretty dry. And oftentimes there's a lot of words in those laws that need some further explanation. So I'm going to go through 4 different definitions that are really important to just know up front. And one is cottage food operation. So this is one that's really interesting to me because when I think of an operation, I usually think of like a business or a place or a building. But for the purposes of the cottage foods law, a cottage food operation is actually a person. So if you are a cottage food operator, you are the cottage food operation. You yourself and I. So it is the person who produces or packages cottage food products at his or her residence and sells those products in accordance with the law. So there is a word in there, the word residence, that doesn't seem like it would need some definition, but it does because the law is really specific about what kind of residence is allowable. So it has to be your primary residence, occupied by you, the cottage food operator. And it can contain only a single kitchen with regular old home residential kitchen appliances. So that's it. So it's truly you in your home. That's what cottage foods is all about. So a cottage food product is a food that is not a potentially hazardous food as defined by the Florida Department of Agriculture rule. So what do they mean by potentially hazardous food? That is a food that requires time and or temperature control for safety to limit pathogenic microorganism growth or toxin formation. That is a whole lot of words to say basically, it can't be a food where you have to either refrigerate it or freeze it to keep it safe to eat. That's really all that says. Is basically, if it's something that can sit out on your counter without starting to become a host for bacteria and mold and other things that could make people sick, then it likely works pretty well within the cottage foods law. Okay. So this is a list that I literally copied and pasted right off of the Florida Department of Agriculture's website. So we'll also be sending you out all of this information that is right off of the Florida Department of Ag's website so that you can read it all right from their website. But this is literally a copy and paste. So they, on their website, do a really good job of listing out what foods are prohibited and what foods are allowable. And I start with the prohibited list, mostly because people tend to read through it and say, what's left? Like what could possibly be left that you could make in your home kitchen that is not on this prohibited list? So we'll get to what is allowable in just a moment, but the prohibited list is pretty long. So anything that's on this list is considered to be a potentially hazardous food. So if you just left it out on your counter for a few days, it would eventually start to actually produce the kinds of pathogens that could make someone really sick. So anything that falls under the category of salsa, sauces like barbecue sauce, ketchup, mustard, any sort of dippy sort of sauce, totally prohibited. All of those things can indeed harbor bacteria pretty quickly unless you keep them refrigerated. And so they're just considered to be too hazardous to be allowable for producing in your home and then selling to the public. Any kind of canned fruits or vegetables, things like chutneys, vegetable butters, vegetable jellies, flavored oils, hummus, pretty much anything with garlic in it, things like that. Any animal, fish, shellfish, poultry, red meat, the whole works. Anything that started its life as an animal is totally prohibited. Even things like beef jerky, right? That is theoretically very shelf stable, but it's very much prohibited under the cottage foods law. Canned pickled products, so things like pickles, sauerkraut, relish, those are all prohibited. Raw seed sprouts are prohibited. And then most bakery goods actually are just fine. Most of them are allowable unless they require refrigeration because they have something like cream, custard, meringue, cream cheese involved in them in terms of icing or filling. Those sorts of things need to be refrigerated and therefore are potentially hazardous. Dairy, pretty much dairy in any form is not allowable. And then this is one that a lot of people feel really surprised about. Cut fresh fruits or vegetables or juice made from fresh fruits or vegetables. Those actually are pretty high up on the potentially hazardous list. Knives cutting through things is a really quick way to introduce pathogens to food. So ice or iced products, those very clearly would have to be time and temperature regulated, by putting them in the freezer. So that clearly is something that is on the non-allowable list. This is a really interesting one, focaccia style breads with vegetables or cheeses. And I'll show you a picture if you're not sure what focaccia is, but it's like a really moist kind of bread. Homemade icing, frosting made with dairy, those sorts of things, because it would need to be refrigerated. Syrups, including elderberry syrup, syrups are not allowable. There's too much liquid involved. So this, the second to last one from the bottom of your screen was actually just very recently added because hemp production is now allowable. Industrial hemp production is now allowable in Florida. And a lot of people are, deriving things like CBD oil from hemp. But under the cottage foods law, your product cannot contain hemp in any form whatsoever. That's just not allowable, regardless of whether or not it meets all of the other criteria for a cottage food. So there's a picture of the type of bread that would not be allowed. Most breads are totally allowable, very regularly produced as a cottage foods product. But breads like this that have some sort of, vegetable, fresh herbs, a lot of moisture on the top, those mold really quickly. And so they are not allowable. Okay, so this is a list that you can see it is much shorter, but this is the allowable list. And these are foods that are not considered to be potentially hazardous. So things like, a loaf of bread, rolls, biscuits, other sort of bread products, cakes, pastries, cookies, as long as they don't have something like a buttercream frosting on them, you're good. Candy, confections, honey. That's one that really surprises a lot of people. And there is a little bit of a caveat with honey, however, and we'll get into that in just a moment. And then things like fruit, very specifically fruit pies and dried fruits, those are okay. And not vegetable pies, fruit pies. And then things like dried herbs, seasoning, spice mixes that you make yourself, totally good. Homemade pasta, this is one that I'm still trying to get some clarification on because most pasta that you see sold at the farmer's market, you're often buying frozen. So I need to get a little more clarification from the Florida Department of Agriculture on the homemade pasta bit. That's one that I've I keep meaning to ask them about and I keep forgetting. And then things like cereal, trail mix, granola, nuts. Nuts are totally fine. Vinegar and flavored vinegars. But notice it does not say oils or flavored oils. Anything that's just like a jar of oil, especially a jar of oil that has anything in it, is actually quite hazardous. So it's not an allowable thing. So vinegar, yes. Oil, no. And then this is my favorite, popcorn and popcorn balls. Apparently that's a really popular food item if it actually made it right onto the list of cottage foods that are allowable in Florida. Maria, do we have any questions?
Not at this time,
Okay,
Sarah.
sounds great. And this is how I'm going to do things. I'll just stop every few minutes as I'm about to transition to a new subject and see if there's questions. So usually questions start to roll as we get in and you start thinking about things more. Cottage foods it's very confusing. There's a lot of gray area. There's some really unclear elements of it. And so one of the things that I have really learned in the process of learning to teach cottage foods is that the absolute best way to get your those gray areas cleared up is to just reach right out to the cottage foods team at the Florida Department of Agriculture. I do it regularly and they're great. So if there's any questions we can't answer tonight, I will send them right over to the Florida Department of Ag, their cottage foods team, and I usually get very quick answers. I think I see some other questions popping up.
Yep, there are some questions popping up. Okay, here we go. There's about 3 of them.
Okay.
The first one's asking, one kitchen, does an additional outside kitchen count?
That is a very good question. And we'll get into that in just a second in much greater detail. But the short answer is no. It has to be in your house, your indoor regular home kitchen. And we'll get further into that, but that's the simple answer.
Another question is, how about herbal tinctures, including an alcohol base?
So that one is very much in the gray area. And that is one that I am actually actively trying to get more information on. And the caveat that I will give to that is that the cottage foods law is about food. So anything that you would be selling as a tincture, in the state of Florida, there's a little bit of a gray area in there, but in general, that might actually start to bump you into a different category of regulation and labeling and all sorts of things. So I am not 100% sure about the answer to that yet. Been working on it, but I'm 95% sure that tinctures are not allowable because it's not food.
Okay, and then we have 2 other questions from the same individual. How about baked meat patties, and how about kimchi?
Nope. Both of those would not be allowed. Anything that started as an animal is very much not allowed. So nothing involving meat in any form ever is allowable. And then kimchi falls into, actually go back over here. See, so kimchi would fall into this category right here of canned pickled products such as corn relish, pickles, and sauerkraut. When I personally make some of these things at home, like when I'm just making them for myself, I don't can my sauerkraut, but it would still, for the purposes of cottage foods, it would still be not allowable because it's still a fermented food. It's a pickled or fermented food. That's just not allowable. Anything else along those lines, Maria? And if not, I'll keep moving.
You can keep moving. I just wanted to say, yes, we will be providing the information about homemade pasta once we find out.
Yes, we will indeed. That one has been, I don't know why it keeps falling off my list of things to clarify, but it needs some clarification. Okay, so this is one of those pieces that makes cottage foods law a little bit confusing for some people, me included. So basically, if it is a vegetable, it cannot make its way into your cottage foods. And the reason for that is because vegetables have a very low sugar and acid level. And it's that sugar and acid that tends to make, that tends to, that is what stops a lot of the pathogens from growing in food. Fruit, on the other hand, is higher in sugar and higher in acidity. And so there's some natural kind of like antibacteria effects that fruit is having. So the way that the cottage foods law breaks it up is if it is a vegetable, it basically, it pretty much cannot be part of your cottage food products. There's some really weird little exceptions to that I'll get into in a moment. So different cultures and even different people within the same culture have a different idea of what is a fruit and what is a vegetable, right? So I want to just clarify what we mean by a fruit or a vegetable. So I come from I actually was a farmer for many years. So for me, when I think about a fruit or a vegetable, I'm thinking about it from the terms of biology, right? Like an actual fruiting part of a plant, so like something like a pepper, coming from a biological standpoint, is a fruit, right? It has seeds. It's the seed-bearing structure of a plant. And then, from a biological standpoint, a vegetable is pretty much all of the other parts of the plant, roots and leaves and stems. That's not the definition that the Florida Department of Ag's cottage foods law is using. They're using our kind of middle of the line cultural definition of a fruit or a vegetable. So a fruit is something that is sweet, high acid, and fleshy. So it comes from trees or bushes or brambles or some other plant, like a strawberry. And a vegetable is the roots, leaves, stems of a plant and the fleshy seed-bearing part of plants that are not very sweet or high in acid. So things like peppers, eggplant, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, zucchini, beans, and peas. For the purpose of this law, those are considered vegetables and not allowable. Okay. And I know that's, some of this is like just about as clear as mud, but once we make it all the way through the end, I think you'll be able to start to put all of these funny little disconnected pieces together, and it'll start making more sense. So that's the definition we go with. That cultural definition of fruit is basically something that comes off of a tree, a bush, or a bramble. Anything else is considered a vegetable, not allowable. Okay, so I'm going to go through this piece really quick. So just we would normally in person we would do something much more hands-on and interactive, but we have a large enough group that we're going to do this kind of silently. So in your own head, think through this list. And we're going to start with raw honey. Do you think that raw honey is something that would be allowable as a cottage food? And this is surprisingly, yes, raw honey. Very specifically, raw honey is acceptable. You cannot pasteurize your honey. That makes it into something that you cannot do in your own home. So raw honey is okay, but only if you are the one who harvests it right out of your hives, you package it yourself, and you sell it yourself. If anyone else does any part of that process, it's not allowable. Okay? Tomato sauce. Based on that definition, that cultural definition of a fruit or a vegetable that we just went through, tomato sauce is not allowable as a cottage food to be produced in your own home. And remember, again, any of these products that we're talking about that are not allowable to be produced and sold out of your own home, it doesn't mean you can't make them. You just can't make them in your own home. You'd have to make them in a commercial kitchen of some sort. So if tomato sauce was your grand plan for a food business, you can still make tomato sauce. You just can't do it in your own home. You've got to find a commercial kitchen. So tomato sauce has all sorts of things in it that are not allowed. It usually has tomatoes and onions and garlic, sometimes other sorts of vegetables. All of those are not allowable. Fresh squeezed orange juice, same thing. Beverages and drinks of any sort are not allowed. They're considered to be hazardous. So even though all you're doing is squeezing orange juice into a cup, it is not allowed. And this list, this funny little list, I did not make this list up myself. This also comes right off of the Florida Department of Agriculture. their Cottage Foods website. And these are some of the most frequently asked questions that they get. And apparently one of them is cake pops. I actually had to look this one up when I first saw it, and then I remembered what it was. So a cake pop, if you don't know what a cake pop is, think of a very tiny cake or a very tiny cupcake that someone sticks on like a lollipop stick. So it's literally like a tiny little cake on a stick, which is so very strange. That a cake pop actually made it onto the Florida Department of Agriculture's website. Clearly, it shows that it is a trendy product. So a cake pop is allowable, but it can be moved over to the unallowable category if you are using some sort of unallowable filling, like a custard or some cream base frosting, or if it has something like disco dust used as a decoration. And this is another one I had to look into more. When I first read about this, clearly it was flagged by the Florida Department of Agriculture, this disco dust thing, because it was something that they've run into as an issue, right? And so I had to look it up because I actually didn't know what disco dust was. And it's basically a really shimmery powder that is okay to use around food, but not on food. It's not actually considered an edible substance, but it is licensed to be, you can use it near food. So don't put disco dust on your cake pops, is what this is saying. Hopefully that was not your business plan. Pumpkin or sweet potato pie. This is one that for a lot of people just feels confusing. So, on the allowable list, it very specifically said fruit pies are just fine, but pumpkin and sweet potato pie are not allowed. And that's because for the purposes of this law, pumpkins and sweet potatoes are both considered to be vegetables. They're not high enough in acid. They're not high enough in sugar. Or sugar they're okay on, but they're not high enough in acid. And so they're not allowed. So no pumpkin pies or sweet potato pies. And so clearly zucchini bread would have the same answer, right? Well, it does not. So this is this funny little exception to being able to use a vegetable in a Cottage Foods product. So if that vegetable, so zucchini is considered to be a vegetable under Cottage Foods law, if that vegetable is fully incorporated, like fully mixed into the batter, and then properly baked, labeled, and packaged, it's allowable. So you basically have to turn it into a bread, not a pie like this pumpkin or sweet potato pie, but like a zucchini bread. That shift, there's something in that baking process that makes it a much more shelf-stable product. So once your zucchini bread is done, you can't decorate it with any sort of garnish of fresh fruit or vegetables or anything like that. That would knock it back into the unallowable category. So hopefully this list helps you a little bit start the process of differentiating what is and isn't allowable. This is really confusing. This confuses pretty much everybody. The first 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times they try to wrap their heads around what is allowable, when and why, and what the exceptions are. So whenever you have questions, you can definitely reach out to me. And if I don't know the answer, I'll reach out directly to the Florida Department of Ag, and they do a great job of very quickly clarifying the gray areas.
Sarah, before we move on, we have some questions that appropriately go with that slide. And here they are. What about dehydrated veggies? Somebody had seen an individual selling dehydrated zucchini and so forth at a farmer's market.
Yeah, and so this is one thing that confuses a lot of people. So just because you see it being sold at a farmer's market does not mean that the person selling it made it in their own home. So something like dehydrated zucchini is not allowable under the Cottage Foods law. So theoretically, that person that you saw selling dehydrated zucchini at the farmer's market is making it in some sort of licensed kitchen, not in their own home. And that's one of those funny little things, is that I think a lot of people assume that if you see it at a farmer's market, it must be Cottage Foods, but actually a lot of what you see being sold at a farmer's market was produced in some sort of licensed kitchen. As far as I'm aware, at least in the area that I actually work, down in the Sarasota area, all of the farmers markets, part of your application process, if you want to be selling some sort of prepared foods, you have to actually demonstrate that you are indeed in compliance with the cottage foods law, or that you are cooking in a commercial kitchen of some sort. So, farmers markets generally do a pretty good job of making sure that their vendors are following the letter of the law. But you can also just ask a vendor too, where they're making their stuff. Yeah, and things like dehydrated zucchini chips or kale chips, things like that. Like in a lot of ways, they're not like terribly hazardous, but if you actually are following the letter of this law, they simply are not allowed. They're considered to be a vegetable, and therefore, not high enough in acid, not high enough in sugar. And so it doesn't have some of those natural microbial preventions right in there.
The other question, Sarah, is rhubarb pie.
No.
Since that's technically a vegetable, we're guessing that's not allowable.
Yeah. So, it's actually a really good question, because rhubarb is one of the tartest things. It's like right up there with lemon in terms of tartness. I will inquire. Rhubarb doesn't grow in at least most of Florida. I'm not sure if it grows in any part of Florida or not. So I am guessing that the Florida Department of Ag has not gotten a whole lot of questions about rhubarb pie, but I will inquire.
There are two more questions, Sarah. Cane syrup, is that allowed?
No, because it is a syrup, and syrup is very specifically not allowed.
And the last question I'm seeing right now is vinegar-based hot sauce. Is that allowed?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, it is not, because it contains peppers. And it usually also contains something like onions or garlic, but just the pepper part, like hot peppers, is enough to disallow it. Unfortunately, I love making hot sauce. Most of the pictures that you're going to see throughout the slideshow are things that I've made in my own home kitchen, or that other friends have made and given to me. So I love making all of these things that we're talking about, and just because I don't sell them doesn't stop me from making them for my own home consumption. Because I take on that risk of my own preparation myself. So I am my own liability. I guess is probably the best way to put that. And I feel fine about feeding myself things that I make in my own home kitchen. But yeah, unfortunately, hot sauce is one of those things that is on the unallowable list because it contains vegetables.
Okay,
Yep.
that's all the questions we have right now, Sarah.
Okay. Sounds good. These are great questions. And it's so fun. Every single time Maria and I teach this class, we get questions about products that neither of us have ever even thought about before. It's really fun to hear all the creativity that people have in terms of thinking about a food business. So we love it. So, I mentioned earlier, because I get so many questions of things that kind of fall into, seeming gray areas, I do call the Florida Department of Agriculture quite a bit and just ask them, if, is this allowable? I have these conversations a lot, and you can do that yourself also. You don't have to go through somebody else. You can just directly call the person who does the actual inspections. But these are some of the funny little things that have needed some clarification over time. So, for example, it's totally allowable to roast whole bean coffee and even grind that coffee in your own home and sell whole bean or ground coffee. But it's not allowable to make the coffee and sell like a cup of coffee from your home kitchen because it's a beverage, right? So as long as you are just selling it dry and somebody else goes home and makes it in their own kitchen, totally fine. As soon as you turn it into a ready-to-drink beverage, not allowable. Wood-fired bread oven, only if that wood-fired oven is in your own home kitchen and basically is your home oven, would it be allowable. I can't imagine having a wood-fired oven in my home in Florida. I actually did used to have one in my home when I lived in Upper New England. And it was how I heated my house and how I did lots of cooking. It was wonderful. I can't imagine wanting to have a wood-fired oven in my own home kitchen in Florida. But if that wood-fired bread oven is anywhere other than your own, basically you're in your kitchen, inside of your home, functioning as your own home kitchen and stove, then it's not allowable. It has to be very much inside of your home in your kitchen. Apple jam and jelly and apple butter and applesauce. These are funny little distinctions. It's all starting with apples, right? Apple jam and jelly are allowable. And then this picture that you see here is a jar of apple butter that a friend of mine made from apples from their apple tree. And they made their own apple butter. Apple butter, despite the fact that it contains basically exactly the same ingredients other than pectin that apple jam and jelly contain, it's not allowable. Same goes for applesauce. And that's basically just because it does not contain the appropriate combination of pectin, sugar, and acid that pull all of the available moisture out of the product and put it at the right acidity level. That combination prevents the growth of mold and bacteria and things like that. So apple butter and applesauce don't have that appropriate combination. So those you cannot sell. But if you turn it into a jam or a jelly that involves pectin, you're good. And then vanilla extract. This is an interesting one. I was really surprised to learn that it is actually allowable, and vanilla extract is alcohol based. So I assumed when I first started looking through these lists a few years ago, I assumed that anything involving alcohol must certainly not be allowable, but actually it is allowable specifically for vanilla extract. But you also have to have an additional set of paperwork and licensing in through the Division of Alcoholic Beverages and Tobacco with the state. Totally doable. You just have to also have that paperwork in place. But then, of course, this one's more obvious. You couldn't turn that vanilla extract into vanilla ice cream because vanilla ice cream has to stay in your freezer and it's dairy based. So those two pieces make it not allowable. So this right here is a jar of blueberry. It was supposed to be blueberry jelly that a friend made, and it didn't set for some reason. And so it's basically just blueberry syrup. It does have pectin, it does have sugar, it was made to be jam, and for some reason it didn't gel, it didn't set. And because it didn't set, it is the consistency of a syrup and therefore classified as a syrup and therefore not allowable. So if you happen to make a big batch of jam that doesn't set, you can't just change the label into strawberry syrup or something like that. You just have to eat it at home yourself. And these are all pictures from actual products from a class that Maria and I taught about a year ago, the last time we taught this class in person. And so normally when we teach this class, you get to actually interact with about 40 different products that we have laid out, most of which I made or a friend made, and look at ingredient lists and kind of pick through things, but we're gonna go with pictures instead today. So bread and butter pickles. This is one that just looks like it wants to be a cottage food, and it is just not for many reasons, including that pickles are very specifically disallowed by cottage foods law. And then anything that is a vegetable. So in this jar there's onions, cucumbers, peppers, and garlic. All 4 of those things are considered to be a vegetable. So there's 5 layers of why this is not an allowable product. This is a jar of curry powder where I bought a whole bunch of different spices from a spice market and then ground them myself in a spice mill. I love making my own spice blends. So this one actually is allowable. It is totally fine because dried herbs, seasonings, and mixtures are fine. And I even sent my ingredient list to the Department of Ag just to really make sure it was okay, and it is. This is a jar of my grandmother's green beans. I'm a really good eater. I love food. There is almost nothing I do not like. I do not love my grandmother's green beans, I have to admit, in large part because most of her jars, I don't know if you can see up here, that is mold actively growing around the rim of this unopened can jar of beans. Um, there are a lot of my grandmother's jars of beans end up looking kind of like this, and it's always been a little hard for me. And so this definitely would not be allowable, but not, I mean, that ring of mold definitely should make something unallowable. But what initially makes this an unallowable product is simply that beans are considered to be a vegetable, so they're just not allowed. This is some herbal tea, some chamomile that I grew, some lavender that I got from somewhere else. I didn't grow it myself. And I love drying herbs, putting them in jars, make some tea. I don't put them in tea bags usually, but you could actually put tea in tea bags and sell that as a product, right? So herbal tea is indeed allowable as long as you are selling it loose or bagged for home brewing. If as soon as you turn it into a ready to drink beverage, that's not allowable anymore. But you can sell dried tea herbs or bagged tea herbs. That's absolutely fine. Somebody gave me 100 pounds of mango a couple of summers ago, all of which needed to be processed that day. They were so ripe. And so what else do you do with 100 pounds of mango but make a whole lot of mango hot pepper jelly, right? I love hot pepper jelly and I love mangoes, so I decided to combine the two. Despite how much I love mango hot pepper jelly, in terms of a cottage food, it's not allowable. This is a product that if I did want to sell it, I could find a commercial kitchen space to rent and go through the process of it being a commercial product of some sort. I could still produce it in small batches, but it's not a product that I can make and sell out of my own home. And that is simply because in each of these jars, there is the equivalent of about one jalapeno pepper in there. And that negates the rest of the allowability of that product. Okay, were there any questions from that, Maria?
Yeah, I was just going to say now's a good time to follow up with some questions. For apple jam, she's asking if she will have to grow her own apples.
No, and that's one of the really interesting things about the cottage food law. You can get 100% of your ingredients from the grocery store. You don't have to grow any of it yourself. One of the ways that the cottage food law kind of initially got pushed into law was because it was seen as a great way for small scale farmers to add some value to what they were producing by being able to process it and then sell it alongside their raw produce. But no, you absolutely can buy all of your ingredients from the grocery store, or from a local farmer, or there's no rules about where you actually get your products from that you then turn into other things. That's a great question.
Okay. Another question is, somebody makes a cake that has a honey syrup poured over it and soaked in. Is that allowed?
That's a very good question. I do not know. That's going to go on my ask the cottage food folks at FDAX list. That's a great question.
I would say, and just putting in my 2 cents, and I would say this would need to be verified, but it would create a very, very moist cake, and a lot of moisture will lend itself to a higher rate of bacteria growth. So I'm guessing no, but Sarah, you'll have to find out on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, great question.
Another question is, what about alcohol-based citrus peel extract? Is that regulated the same as vanilla extract?
That's a great question. My guess is yes. That's totally my guess. So I will also specifically ask that question. I love this. I love all the ideas that people have for food products. It's so fun.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And here's the next question. What makes a commercial kitchen okay? And is that the kitchen is inspected and licensed, or do you need to have your process inspected?
Yeah, both. Yeah, so well, it depends. There's a few different categories and layers to different kinds of licensed kitchens in Florida. And and so it varies a little bit depending on what sort of layer of licensing you have, what sort of facility you're producing in, what your end product is, and things like that. So it does depend a little bit. That's like a whole nother avenue of conversation. But it's a really good question. So at the very least, it does mean that your product would be basically verified to make sure it is not a potentially hazardous food, and the space that you are using would indeed have to be inspected and licensed. Yep. And then another layer of like labeling and things like that that would also come into play. Any
That's all the questions we have for right now, Sarah.
Sounds good. Okay. Keep those questions rolling. Okay. So this is where we work through the process of where you can and cannot, what your home kitchen can and cannot be. Okay. And it's so interesting. This is the part where every time we teach this class, we tend to get some pushback where people want to come up with like one more idea to see if they can kind of get around things. So I'm curious if anyone else if anyone else has some how can I get around this kind of ideas. But if you actually read the law, it's very cut and dry. Processing has to be in your home kitchen, and your home kitchen must be in your primary residence. It must be in your own home, and you must be using water that is potable, or like to drinking standards from a properly constructed on-site well or a municipal water system. So the picture that you can see on your screen is not in somebody's primary residence. It is not in a home of any sort, and they appear to be camping. So it is likely that water is not potable. So that scenario right there is very much not cottage foods allowable. So the things that your home kitchen cannot be is your second home. It truly must be your primary residence. It cannot be your vacation home. And unless your motorhome or your RV is your primary residence, and you have proof of it being your primary residence, then you also cannot produce in your motorhome. It cannot be a rented kitchen, a borrowed kitchen, your neighbor's kitchen. It can't be in a barn or a shed or a lean-to or an outbuilding, and it just can't be outside at all. It must truly be inside your own primary residence. Good. So it's really, it's cottage foods, like inside your own little cottage. It's kind of the idea behind it. Okay, so this is where, if you weren't already a bit confused, this can add a layer of confusion. But I'm going to try really hard to keep us all together in terms of where you can and can't sell. And I'm going to throw in a couple more definitions in the process. So there are basically 5 different places or kind of ways that you can sell your cottage food products. One is directly from your own home, like where people literally come and knock on your door and pick up their product. You can sell at a farmer's market, and there is a caveat to that. You can sell at a flea market, and again, there is a caveat to that. Your own roadside stand, caveat, and I'll go into what that caveat is in just a second. You can also actually sell products through your own website. That's totally fine. What you can't do is then mail your product. You actually have to hand deliver that product to a customer, or the customer has to come directly to you to pick it up. So you still have to interface directly with your customer, but the actual sale can happen through the internet, through your website. Okay, so this is the prohibited list, is where things get a little bit confusing, and I'm going to try to keep us all together on this. Okay, so We just talked about how farmers market, flea markets, and your own roadside stand are generally allowable locations. So what makes them not allowable is if you are also selling another food item that does require some sort of permit to sell it. So something that is some sort of food that is not a cottage food. As soon as you sell even one other food that is not a cottage food, but that requires a different kind of, or that actually requires a permit to sell in Florida, then you can't be selling cottage foods alongside that at your farmers market stand, your flea market stand, or your home roadside stand. Okay, so it's you can't mix different kind of food types basically, or different kind of permitted, non-permitted food types. You can't sell anywhere that already is inspected or permitted, because cottage foods very specifically cannot be sold from any kind of permitted food establishment. And pretty much every kind of food establishment you can think of in Florida has a permit other than cottage foods. So, restaurants, any sort of processor, grocery stores, any of those sorts of things, those all are very much permitted. So that means you cannot sell to restaurants. You also cannot sell on consignment. So you can't sell through somebody else. Like maybe your friend has, like a boutique kind of like local product store where they sell like locally made, batiks and locally made candles and locally made artwork and things like that. You can't sell your cottage food product through that space because that building and that business actually has to be permitted. And any sort of permitted building is not, other than your own home, is not somewhere that cottage foods can be sold. You can't sell to a wholesaler, a distributor, or any sort of broker because you have to be selling directly to the final customer. And the wholesaler is not the final customer. That wholesaler is going to sell it again and then again and again. You also cannot sell it outside of Florida. And we had someone the last time we taught this class that said, I was hoping to do a farmer's market that's right on the Florida-Georgia border. Do I have to ask my customers if they're from Georgia? And no, you don't. You just have to, you yourself can't take your product into Georgia or another state. You can only sell it in Florida. What your customer does with it after they've bought it in Florida, that part doesn't matter. But you have to sell it in Florida. And then you can't sell it through the mail or any other sort of delivery service. So like you can't hire your neighbor's teenager to deliver food for you on the side. That's not allowable. And I think I saw a whole bunch of questions pop up, Maria.
You
Yes.
did,
Yes.
and they're really good
Great.
good questions. Does my primary residence mean that I have to live in my home for more than 6 months?
It is, however, the state of Florida defines primary residence. And you know what? I don't remember. Do you know, Maria? Or does anyone else happen to know?
No, I don't remember.
I think that's accurate, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I think it is, it's like 6 months plus 1 day makes it your primary residence.
Okay, the next question, can you sell cottage foods along with fresh garden produce not processed?
Yes, as long as as long as you are selling it from some sort of non-permitted space. So, and I'll clarify one more layer about what is and isn't an allowable space. So as long as you're selling those vegetables or your fresh fruit or whatever, also in a non-permitted space, that's okay. You don't need a permit to grow or sell fresh produce in Florida.
Okay, and the last question I'm seeing right now, if you are selling cake pops off of a website and they are mailed out, it must be made in a commercial kitchen, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yep, spot on. Yep. So yeah, you absolutely can make and sell cake pops in Florida, just not from your own home. Yep,
Okay,
that is spot on.
that's all for right now, Sarah.
Okay. So here's a couple layers of clarification. So you saw the word roadside stand a couple of times in the previous slide. So for the purposes of cottage foods in Florida, this is how roadside stand is being defined. A roadside stand is something that's an impermanent structure, like a pop-up tent, like something that's truly very temporary, where like you literally can fold it up and put it in your trunk at the end of the day. So you can't sell from any permanent structure other than your own home. Your own home is like the grand exception to everything, which is pretty amazing. So for the purposes of the cottage food law, think of roadside stand basically as a pop-up tent. That's really the easiest way to think about it. And that's not that the actual, if you read through like all the nuances of the cottage foods law, it's not that, it doesn't spell that out. But in my process of getting clarification from the Florida Department of Agriculture, the people who are doing the actual monitoring of cottage foods law, they are very specific that what they're talking about is something like a pop-up tent, okay? So when I think of a roadside stand, and when many people think of a roadside stand, and, and especially like within the English language, when we think of a roadside stand, we're usually thinking about, kind of like some sort of like wooden lean-to kind of open air-ish structure where, a farmer or something like, or someone like a farmer is selling fresh produce, maybe some flowers, maybe some eggs, maybe some canned things. So in that context, something like a wooden lean-to structure, that is a permanent structure. You can't fold it up and stick it in your trunk at the end of the day. That you'd need some sort of permit for in order to sell out of it. So you would not be able to sell cottage foods in that type of roadside stand. Is that any questions about that specific? So basically think pop-up tent and you're good. So I'll give you a couple of pictures just to show you what I'm talking about. So this is actually someone from a farmer's market in Sarasota County. He is selling raw honey. He does it all himself in his pop-up tent. This is at the farmer's market. He's totally good to go under the cottage foods law. I don't actually know if this particular producer does produce in the cottage foods, under the cottage foods law in his own home, or if he is processing somewhere else, but this would be a totally allowable setup all the way around. This is what I'm talking about in terms of like some sort of permanent building, like these poles are, they're concreted into the ground. It has a roof. It's pretty permanent sort of structure. That's not a cottage foods allowable building. Okay. So special events are worth talking about. Many people who want to be doing something with cottage foods want to be able to sell for special events like weddings or birthdays and things like that. And that is absolutely fine as long as, the cottage food product is produced by you and it's sold by you, and you have to actually deliver it to the specific event venue. So for example, if you are, catering the cake for a wedding, and the, maybe the bride's mother says, just drop it off at my house and I'll take it to the wedding venue myself. That actually is technically not allowed. You actually technically have to take it directly to where it's going to be eaten at the specific event venue. Just kind of an interesting little funny little nuance with the law. So that's that. If you're doing an event, that's how you have to do it. Okay, we're going to get into labeling. Were there any other questions, Maria, before we switch gears?
No questions, just a comment. I think about the gentleman when you showed the photograph of the individual selling the raw honey. A comment came out that he is not making this himself because she knows him.
Okay, there we go.
Is that allowable?
So that's a great question. So it's totally fine for him to be selling this product. If he is getting it from someone who is processing it in their own home kitchen, that step, that actually is not allowable. He can't resell something made in somebody else's home kitchen. Does that make sense? You yourself, you the person who produced it, produced it, processed it, labeled it, you have to be the one selling it to the final customer in order to do that all under the cottage foods law in your own home. You can't resell somebody else's cottage food product. So hopefully this gentleman is getting his product from someone who is following the letter of the law and producing this in a way that is allowable. Does that clarify that well enough? Anyway, this is all just really confusing stuff. It just is, and it becomes clearer over time. But there's a lot of things that don't seem to quite add up when you're just starting to learn the whole process.
No, there's no more questions right now, Sarah.
Sounds good. Okay. Okay. So labeling. Labeling. This is one of the world's most boring labels, but it was made that way on purpose, basically. This is just the totally generic example of what your label has to require. This is the label that the Florida Department of Ag created as the example of what your label needs to contain. So on the right side of your screen, it's just all of the things that your label has to contain as an example. And then on this side is the actual bullet point list of what those things are. So your product does indeed have to have the name and address of the cottage food operation. And one of the reasons at the very beginning of this class, I defined what cottage food operation is because this one really throws a lot of people. The producer, are the cottage food operation. So really what this means is that you have to put your name and your home address right on your label. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Not everyone wants to have their name and home address right on a label. So if you are doing cottage foods, you do have to. So just know that. And then the name of your product. So in this example, chocolate chip cookie. And then the ingredients of what's in your product in descending order by weight. Just like you'd see on a regular label from something you would get at a grocery store. I have to sneeze. Excuse me. I did some vacuuming earlier today. I got some dust up my nose. And then the total weight or volume of the product. So, for this example, you can see the net weight is 3 ounces. So it's a little package of cookies that weighs 3 ounces. And then the allergy information, that's actually required by federal law. And I'll show you a little more about that in just a moment. But you can see on this screen, there it is, contains wheat, eggs, milk, soy, walnuts. That right there is that federally required label for allergens. And then if you make any nutritional claim, that gets into some kind of dicey area. You have to, nutritional claims are something you really want to steer clear of. There's very specific federal labeling requirements when you get into nutritional claims. They're quite complicated. It's actually, it's quite a process. I don't recommend trying to go there with cottage foods. And then you have to have this little this exact phrasing right here somewhere on your label in at least 10-point type. So you can't make it so small that people can't read it. In a color that provides a clear contrast to the label color. So basically you cannot hide this statement that your product was, quote, made in a cottage food operation that is not subject to Florida's food safety regulations. You have to have that on your package. Okay. So if you do not feel particularly crafty when it comes to making a label, there's all sorts of templates and stamps and stickers and other ways that you can make your own label. There's even companies that specialize in having the right phrases as they align with different states' cottage foods laws. So you can just do an internet search for cottage food label Florida stamp or template or something like that, and lots of things pop up. You can also absolutely make your own, something like this one that you see on the right side of your screen. So this is another one that, it contains all the right information. It's a great label. And this is one that I really wanted to use to highlight again. Here's how they list their allergen info down here. They call it allergen info, contains milk, eggs, wheat, and soy. They make it really clear that this is about allergies. So the actual federal law requires that you identify any of the ingredients from this list right here on your product. Some of these things like seafood would not be in your cottage food product anyway. This is just the list of products that are required for any food product in the United States. If it's in there, it has to be listed on the ingredient list as an allergen. So that's that piece. So I love this example. Somebody actually gave me this as a gift maybe 5 years ago. I've been dragging this little jar of mustard around for 5 years because it's become such a great teaching tool. I love this label. It's a great little label. It's got all the right information on it. It's all there. It's good. But it's mustard. It's mustard, and mustard is very specifically not allowed under the cottage foods law. So it's kind of a bummer. It's a great label. All the rules are followed for making the label. It's just that the product itself is actually not an allowable product. So there you go.
Sarah,
yes.
we do have a new question.
Okay.
Do we need an occupational license from our county of residence, for example, Sarasota? And what do we do with sales tax?
That's a really good question. So that is going to, so the occupational license is going to differ from county to county. Most counties do not require any additional sort of licensing or things like that. Some do. Same with some municipalities do. Also check in, make sure that that selling or making, having any sort of home business is not disallowed by your HOA. So definitely do all of your check-in. This is the Florida law. Localities, individual regions, counties, municipalities, they can have more restrictive laws. So it is definitely important to check in with your local regulations. I'm not aware of county or municipality specific limitations in Sarasota County. Outside of Sarasota County, I don't know. So check in with folks in whatever county you live in. Yeah, and then so then the tax piece is yes, any in the United States, any business that we have, any way that we make money, we technically are all supposed to be claiming that and paying taxes on that, just like any other small business or business of any size or any sort. It is something that you are indeed supposed to claim, that you are supposed to pay self-employment taxes on, things of that nature. Yep. Okay, so talking about taxes is never very fun, but samples do tend to be fun. So samples. So samples must be pre-packaged in your home kitchen. Just like everything you do around cottage foods, you have to do fully in your home kitchen. You can sell them somewhere else, but all of the packaging, preparing, all of that has to happen in your home kitchen, and that includes samples. You can use individually wrapped samples or little sample cups with lids, or some way that basically keeps people's hands and the air that they're breathing off of other people's samples is what we're shooting for. The samples themselves do not require a label, but if you are giving samples, there has to be basically the whole label that you would normally put on a full package of whatever that product is on display with the samples, so that customers can see the ingredient list and the allergens. So Not all of these things on this screen are an allowable way to give a sample. So just having like a loose pile of like caramels that are sitting out that people can take, that's not allowable. They would have to be individually wrapped. You can give caramels as a sample. They just have to be wrapped in your own kitchen first. Cut fruit. Cut fruit, if you are selling it like something like a fruit salad, not allowable. I mean, cut like fruit, fresh fruit unto itself in any sort of cut form is simply not allowed in the cottage foods law. So it's not a good idea to cut samples of fruit and give it out. And you definitely cannot sell like halved fruit because you've processed that fruit in some way under the cottage foods law. You may be able to do it under other regulations, but you can't do it from a cottage foods kitchen. Then something like that, although I don't think I would give little truffles away as samples. They're too special. But if you wanted to, that kind of packaging is okay. And then some odds and ends rules. These don't fit super well in other places. So some people say, well, I have a really, really big home kitchen. Can I just put commercial equipment in my really, really big home kitchen? And you can't. And that is so like really big equipment, like you can see in this picture, you know, like big warming ovens and huge pots and things like that. And it's basically just because a home kitchen with a residential size sink, you just can't effectively wash large commercial equipment. It's not, you can't get it to the right degree of clean and sanitized. This is relevant only for folks that have worked in the food industry in the past. This comes up a lot with folks that have, you know, run a restaurant or things like that. And in most of the permitted food world in this country, all of the infrastructure and equipment and what's it called? Things like your stoves and fridge and things like that have to have a little stamp on them that says NSF approved. NSF once upon a time actually was an acronym, and now it's just a series of letters, but it's basically kind of like a third-party auditor of food safe equipment. So you don't have to use an NSF approved equipment in your home kitchen. This law just assumes that this is truly, truly, truly your home kitchen. You don't need any kind of special equipment, stove, fridge, dishwasher, any of that. It's just regular old home equipment. So that's a huge money saver for folks that come from the restaurant world and know how expensive NSF equipment is. And then we already talked about this last piece, is that different. This is the Florida cottage foods law, but your local area could restrict some of what's allowable. So just check in with your locality. We're getting close to the end. So interestingly enough, pets and animals are not addressed in the cottage foods law. But I just want to really flag, be careful if you have pets around. Pets are not known for being the most food safe, careful creatures, especially in kitchens. And that simply does create some liability in your world. So there's a lot of liability around producing food and selling it to people. And Maria is going to talk about food safety in just a moment. But I really just wanted to highlight this pets in the kitchen thing. If you do have pets, I would highly, highly encourage keeping your pets excluded from the kitchen, keeping them out of the kitchen. If you are going to have a cottage food business in your own home. And at the very, very least, on days that you're producing in your kitchen, fully exclude your pets and sanitize down that whole kitchen before you start producing in it, because it truly is a liability. And you truly could make someone sick, totally inadvertently. I see a question pop up, Maria.
Yes. Should you have insurance to cover liability?
Such a good question. I'm so glad somebody asked it. Yes, it's a very good idea to have liability insurance. There's various companies out there that will sell, at a very low rate. Product liability insurance, general liability insurance. There's a handful of insurers out there that are, comfortable and familiar with cottage foods law, and you can generally negotiate a pretty darn cheap policy, and it often is just bundled with your other policies. So it's definitely a good idea. We live in a world where things happen, and lawsuits happen and things like that. So it's a really good way to protect yourself from things that you would never in a million years intend, but sometimes things just happen.
Okay, that's all the questions we have right now. Oh, wait.
Okay.
Are there rules for how much a commercial kitchen can charge you for making small items in their establishment?
No, there's not. And how much a commercial kitchen does charge varies wildly. And in just a second, I'm actually gonna show you a couple of different places that you can search for shared commercial kitchen space. There's some great ways to search for affordable commercial kitchen space, but how much they charge is totally up to them. And we'll send you, and again, we'll send you all this information, but including the information on this slide. But that's, just wanted you to see that's what the statutes and the codes and things like that are called. And then inspections. So I haven't really talked about inspections yet, and that's because generally, unless you have done something wrong and somebody has reported you, which absolutely happens, it very much happens, then there isn't an inspection. So basically, if you follow the rules, you're kind of good to go. If anybody though does report you, or if you happen to be selling at a farmer's market and someone from the Florida Department of Agriculture just happens to be strolling through and sees something that should not be happening, you will indeed hear from an inspector. They'll start by giving you a call. They will talk to you about your products, help you understand why you are in violation. They will also let you know that you must immediately stop selling any and all products that are in violation of the cottage food law. And then from there, I would recommend that you follow their instructions. If you don't, or if there is another report, then you can indeed expect to be inspected. And if you're really kind of pushing that line, your business can be shut down. So this is one of those laws where it's kind of amazing in how lenient it is. There's so many rules that go with this law, but it is pretty amazing. You can produce and sell $50,000 worth of food from your own home kitchen in Florida without an inspection, without a license, without a permit, without oversight, as long as you follow those basic rules. And so this is one of those laws where, like, if everyone who's selling under this law just follows those rules and follows those laws, everybody wins in the process. And so it's really one of those like kind of collective good sorts of scenarios. So just remember that if you want to kind of shirk those rules a little bit, it kind of has a ripple effect impact on other people who are also cottage food producers, and vice versa. And I generally find that when people discover they're not in compliance, it's actually that they just were confused about something with the law, and then they quickly change it. But just, so it'd be a bummer though to set up a whole business around a misunderstanding. So I highly recommend reaching out and making sure that your business plan actually makes sense and is in line with the cottage foods law.
So before you go on, Sarah,
Yeah.
there are two more questions. How about the Safe Food Handlers license from Florida is one of the questions.
Do you know about that, Maria?
I don't think they're required to get the Safe Food Handlers license.
No.
I think that would just be a training that they possibly could take.
Yes. Yeah, you definitely, there's no license of any sort that you have to hold with cottage foods. It's really interesting to me that you don't have to hold that license for cottage foods. There's a similar, for most of the states that do have a cottage foods law, um, most of them require, most of them do actually require some sort of home kitchen inspection, and they do require you to take a food safety class. And Florida doesn't, interestingly enough. But yeah, I think most other kinds of food establishments do require a food safety class. Is that correct, Maria? And license? Just
You
if
mean
I
other states?
in
Is that what
Florida.
you're asking? Oh, in Florida? Other than Florida, I know they do. And in Florida, it's just recommended.
Okay.
The next question that came in is, do you have advice as to what products are the most popular and most profitable?
That's a great question.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you know what? Interestingly enough, I don't think anyone has ever asked me that question before. That's so interesting. That's such a good one. I don't actually, and I don't even know if there is any sort of like centralized list of all of the types of foods in Florida that are being sold as cottage foods, because it's not permitted and it's not licensed and it's not really tracked. So I don't know, but that's a great question. I'm sure, I would guess that it probably varies depending on what part of the state you're in, just because of, kind of different regions of the state have kind of different food cultures and things like that. Um, and certainly even from like, one community to a next, what you can charge for a product is really going to change. I actually was a farmer's market vendor as a vegetable farmer for many years. And I can tell you for sure that different, even, if you go to 3 different farmers markets in a week, they just bear really different prices, and that people have really different buying patterns. And it varies a lot. So it's a great question. But there's one really great resource, and I need to remember to add this to the resource list. All across the nation, there's a system connected to universities, called Small Business Development Centers. And it's a free service to help small businesses develop their business plans and things of that nature. They're truly an amazing resource. There's small business development centers scattered throughout Florida. I would really recommend, as you start the process, if you haven't already, of really looking into doing a business plan and working with a free business advisor through the Small Business Development Center. They're pretty amazing. It's an amazing service, and they can help you with some of those questions of product and how much to be charging and things like that.
That's all we have for right now, Sarah.
Okay. So I just wanted to show you this page. This is literally just a screenshot of the Cottage Foods page, or part of the Cottage Foods page, on the Florida Department of Agriculture. And just a reminder again, there's so many other kinds of food establishments in Florida. So if after hearing everything tonight, you realize that what you want to produce just doesn't fit under the Cottage Foods law, you just want to look up food establishments, Florida Department of Ag, and it'll bring you to this list of other kinds of food establishment licensing. Okay, so shared commercial kitchen space. So as somebody already mentioned earlier, or indicated rather, so commercial kitchen space can be a really pricey thing to tap into if you decide that cottage foods is not for you. But there's a kind of a growing trend of truly like shared commercial kitchen spaces. They go by different names. Sometimes you will see them called incubator kitchens, a chef incubator, shared commercial kitchen, commercial commissary kitchen, things like that. Especially if it has the word incubator in it, you know that there's likely actually a nonprofit element to it. And so part of what incubator kitchens or incubator shared kitchens, or whatever string of words you want to use, often what they're doing is literally like incubating or helping you start a prepared foods business of some sort. So they actually will have staff on site to help you with product testing, with labeling, with making sure you know how to use commercial equipment, all sorts of things like that. And incubator kitchens generally are less expensive to access than just regular old commercial kitchen space that you rent. They generally are subsidized in some way through grants or things of that nature. There's a very large one down in Immokalee. In Sarasota County, there's one called Your Culinary Place. It's a shared commercial commissary kitchen and chef incubator. That is a mouthful, but in Sarasota County, we do have one. I'm not sure if they're up and running right now just because of COVID, but they do exist. And then if you live in a different part of the state, there is this really handy website called thekitchendoor.com, and you can use it to just search all of the shared commercial kitchen spaces across the entire state. It's very, very handy. It's a great way to see what's out there. And that is all that I have for you tonight. We'll be sending you, Maria is going to talk next about some really, really important food safety considerations, because we talked about earlier, it is really important to not make your customers sick, and for liability and other reasons. So Maria's got a bit, and we'll both be compiling a bunch of information and sending it to you via email in the coming days. So thank you all very, very much. And I'm going to switch over screen. So we'll take like a 1 or 2 minute break while I switch my screen over and Maria's screen comes up for her portion. When I see our supervisor, Miss Brenda Rogers, is on the line. She is the Southwest Florida Southwest District. I'm so tired, y'all. The Southwest Extension District Director for the University of Florida. And I had a feeling she was going to pop in tonight. There we go.
Really good lesson. I learned a lot, and I enjoyed the humor that you've incorporated into it.
Good.
The questions have been just tremendous. So
excellent.
Everybody, look forward to the rest of the program.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Brenda. And Brenda actually also used to be, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, Brenda, Food and Consumer Services. No. What was your role when you used to be an extension agent?
I was Family and Consumer Science, the same as Maria.
Yes. I've been awake since 2 o'clock this morning, everyone. And so my brain is struggling. I had a neighbor who was banging around in the middle of the night, slamming cabinets, and my brain is sluggish. So thank you for sticking with me through acronyms.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for sharing the screen. Of course, somehow I had some type of a premonition that I was going to have a computer glitch, and of course I did. So I am not able to share my screen. So thank you, Sarah, for progressing through the slides for me. My session will not take an hour, but it is an important aspect of cottage foods, and you'll find that some of the reasons why you are not allowed to sell certain foods, we will discuss in this portion of the presentation. But I am Maria Portelos-Ramito, the Family and Consumer Sciences Agent at our Extension Office. So can we go forward, Sarah? So basically, we're going to talk about what is a foodborne illness, how it occurs, how do we keep our food safe, some best practices, and just some basic other considerations as you progress forward into your cottage food adventure. Next. So hopefully your kitchen won't look anything like this one. It's a pretty bad situation. But cottage food operation is fairly unique in that it doesn't, like Sarah mentioned, does not require any type of inspection or permit. You don't need any type of food safety training. And it can be a very unique processing environment. And if you look at this photo, you see so many obvious violations besides the garbage all over and chemicals up on the windowsill and so forth. So hopefully your kitchen is much better than this one in this photo. Next picture, please. So what is a foodborne illness? It's also can be called a food poisoning. Many times when you're out and about, people will say, I have food poisoning and it was horrible and so forth. But it's common, it's costly, and yet it can be very preventable. And it's just simply caused by eating food that's contaminated either by chemically or through a bacteria, or it could even be caused by physical substances. And basically, each year, 1 in 6 Americans become sick from eating contaminated beverages. And when you think about that statistic of 1 in 6, think about yourself if you've ever experienced a foodborne illness episode. Did you go to your Department of Health? Did you go to the doctor to report it? Because most times you'll find that most individuals don't. They just suffer through it. And they figure in the next 24, perhaps 48 or 72 hours, they will begin to feel better. So this statistic of 1 in 6 could actually be, more like 1 in 5 Americans getting sick by consuming contaminated foods and beverages. And there's many different disease-causing microbes and pathogens that can contaminate food. Next slide, please. So the CDC estimates that roughly 48 million people a year get sick, with approximately 128,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths. And usually when you mention that you can die from a foodborne illness, most people are surprised by that. They just feel that they'll recover and life will go on. But some foodborne illnesses can be so severe that it can produce death, and it also can produce lifelong ailments, and it could leave you deaf and so forth. Next slide, please. So food does become hazardous by contamination, and it's really contamination that's unintended. People don't really intend to process incorrectly or work with food incorrectly, but it happens, and it's the presence of those harmful substances or microorganisms in our food. Next slide, please. So we mentioned that food can become contaminated from chemical hazards like cleaning products, as hand sanitizers, polishes, and you think, how can that happen? Well, many times people will use food containers, have them emptied out, clean them, and fill them with a cleaning product. They don't label it correctly, or it is labeled correctly, but it is stored in the wrong location where food is being prepared, and accidentally can be added to a food item. And physical hazards, things like hair, nails, our fingernails, plastics, glass, dirt. I was once eating in a local restaurant, a chain, and I had ordered a salad. Began eating my salad, and I bit down on something that I knew wasn't food. And when I took it out of my mouth, it was a fairly large piece of plastic that I don't believe I could have swallowed without choking. It turned out that it was actually a piece of the dishwasher had fallen into my salad. So physical hazards, Band-Aids, many times you can find, by accident, jewelry or Band-Aids in our food as well. And of course, biological hazards. And we're going to talk about that in our next slide, please. So biological can be bacteria, fungi, parasites, viruses, and like we said, even those toxic chemicals fall into their own category. But all these types of things can make their way and contaminate our foods that we like to consume. Next slide, please. So who's most susceptible? When we think about even COVID, we've been told over and over again that it's the very young, it's older adults or chronically ill. And that's the same thing with any type of a foodborne illness, any very young because of their immature immune system and our aging immune system if we're older adults. And if you're chronically ill on chemotherapy or any kind of other therapies, you will have an impaired immune system. Next slide, please. So cottage food risk factors that contribute to a foodborne illness is number one is, and it's not that we don't mean to do these, it's just that we don't sometimes think about it. But practicing poor hygiene and food handler health, if we're not feeling well, are we preparing food? Using contaminated equipment, and of course, cross-contamination. Next slide, please. So how can I handle food safely? First, practice good personal hygiene, and we do that by restraining our hair, wearing a hairnet, wearing a hat if your hair is short. Remove all your jewelry when preparing food. Even if the jewelry doesn't make its way in the food, many times the food will get caught in your jewelry and it just becomes an unsanitary situation. Always use clean aprons and clean clothes. When you're done for the day with the task, always put your apron in the wash, your clothes in the wash, and start fresh the next day. And really trim your nails to avoid any type of nail polish. So keeping your nails very short, definitely not using, I'm a nail biter, so, fake nails that are glued onto on top of your nails. You definitely do not want to be using food or preparing food with fake nails. And avoid any unsanitary habits or actions, and proper wound care. No food preparation during an illness. Use proper gloves, and of course, washing your hands frequently and when appropriate. Next slide, please. So let's talk a minute about our personal hygiene, especially when it comes to hand washing. So before you begin to work with food, after you use the toilet, when you go to change tasks. So if, for example, this wouldn't pertain to cottage foods, but if you are working with raw chicken or raw meat and you change your task to chopping up a salad, of course you would use a different cutting board, but you would also make sure you thoroughly wash your hands in between. And it's really recommended that you chop that salad first, wash your hands, and then handle the raw meat. And of course, you want to wash your hands whenever you touch your hair, your face, a pet, your child, and anything like that. Next slide, please. So we've all received plenty of lessons over the last several months in regards to hand washing, but they can be said over and over again. Wash with warm, clean, potable water. Use soap and lather well, and you want to wash your hands or rub them together pretty vigorously for about 20 seconds, which means the happy birthday song or the ABC song twice. Dry your hands on paper towels or a clean towel that's designated just for hand drying. You never want to share a hand drying towel with a towel that you would use to dry dishes. And you don't want to use a common kitchen towel or a common towel in the bathroom. It should be a specific towel just to dry your hands. And I know in my house, this is like my biggest contention. We have two different kinds of towels. We have solid and we have striped, with the solid towels being for dishes and the striped for hands. And I swear we're still learning that after all these years. Next slide, please. So, you know, when Cottage Foods was established, they kept in mind these big five illnesses that you'll see quite often on the news. And there's good reason, is because that they can spread very, very quickly. So you won't see things like anything with salmonella, any type of food associated with that could be linked to salmonella, which would be, of course, chicken, but also beverages and ready-to-eat foods. E. coli is usually linked to ground beef, but is also linked to contaminated produce. Now, Shigella you might not see as frequently in the news, but that's usually easily contaminated by our hands. And it's usually, you'll find that in salads, but it also is in our temperature controlled foods like potato salad, tuna salad, shrimp, and so forth. And Salmonella, E. coli, and Shigella are all bacterial, where hepatitis A and norovirus both are viruses. But the hepatitis A you'll find in ready-to-eat and shellfish. The norovirus, many times you'll see that associated on cruise ships. And one of the reasons is that it spreads like wildfire. And it has a lot to do with contaminated water, which brings us to the point of that is why Cottage Foods will allow you to sell the coffee beans, but not the water to make the coffee itself, because they need to be absolutely sure that the water is potable. And so even if you are at a farmer's market selling your selling your product, using potable water to wash your hands, or at least bottled spring water to wash your hands to help control the norovirus is important. Next slide, please. So do not prepare foods if you've been diagnosed or live with somebody closely who has been diagnosed with any of those big five illnesses. But also, if you're not feeling well, you've had a fever, please, it's not the time to start preparing foods in your home kitchen. Next slide. So how do you know the difference really between a foodborne illness or food sickness versus getting the flu? And usually when the symptoms come on suddenly, you could be watching TV and all of a sudden the thought comes, I need to get to the bathroom quickly. Usually is an indication that you are suffering from a foodborne illness. But it can, some of the foodborne illnesses will have some of these symptoms and some will not. But these are the usual symptoms: fever with or without a sore throat, a general weakness or tiredness. You could have abdominal pain, cramps, vomiting, nausea, jaundice, and diarrhea. And sometimes you can have 3 or 4 of those symptoms all at the same time. And sometimes people feel that if they just get it out of their system, they're fine. But sometimes it takes days before and weeks before you actually start to feel better again. Also, many times people associate a foodborne illness with something they perhaps ate the night prior or a few hours ago, and that's not necessarily the case. Many times these pathogens that we take in through eating might be in very small amounts, and they sit and multiply in our gut. So it could actually be a food item that you ate a week ago. So don't necessarily think that it's something that you ate within the last 12 or 24 hours. Next slide, please. So if you do have a cut or some type of a sore, a scab on your hand or an exposed part on your arm, you do need to cover it with an impermeable waterproof bandage. Keep it clean and keep it dry. And it's a good thing to use gloves to keep the bandages in place, because like we said, it can become a physical contaminant if it falls into the food. And you do not want to touch any ready-to-eat food with your bare hands. If you don't want to wear gloves, you can use service papers or tongs instead. Next slide, please. And if your hands are dirty and you're putting on gloves, you can still transfer that bacteria to the outside of the glove. And you think about that. I mean, if both of my hands are dirty, when I go to put on a rubber glove, I'm using my dirty hand to do that. The gloves itself are permeable over time, and that's why we change them often. So even if I do make those gloves on without too much contamination, over time with my dirty hands, my gloves will become very contaminated. So remember, when you do wear gloves, you can't feel if the glove gets dirty, so change them often. And bacteria will grow faster on those gloves and on skin covered by gloves than just your bare hands. So wash your hands frequently, change your gloves often. Next slide, please. So it is okay to hold bandages covering cuts on your hand, and it's okay to protect against any kind of skin irritants, such as using gloves to protect against citrus fruits and cleaning chemicals. But when you are serving your pre-packaged food samples, you can serve them. If they have a lid, you don't need to have gloves. Next slide, please. Do we have any questions in the chat box? I should have stopped a while ago. I didn't even think of that. Sarah?
We do not.
Okay.
Fun going.
Okay. So poor cleaning and sanitizing can happen the following ways: that equipment and utensils are not washed, rinsed, and sanitized between uses. And this is important when Sarah spoke about using kitchen equipment. There's no way you can properly wash, rinse, and sanitize those large pieces of equipment. Food contact surfaces are wiped clean rather than being washed, rinsed, and sanitized. But there's a caveat. When we say wiped clean, you can use paper towel to wipe them clean. And we mean by that, if something drips or spills or splatters out of the bowl, you can wipe that while you are still preparing that food item. You don't have to wash, rinse, and sanitize. Wiping cloths that you do use, wiping cloths are not stored in a sanitizer solution between uses, and sanitizing solutions are not at required levels to sanitize effectively. So wiping cloths do need to be stored in a sanitizing solution between uses, and that level needs to be at a required level to sanitize, and that's on the next screen. So all food surfaces and equipment should be washed, rinsed, and sanitized before they're used. But while you are preparing the food, if something drips, spills, you can use that paper towel and wipe those counters with rags soaked in a sanitizer or bleach solution. Next slide. And our solution is really very simple. And I have found over the course of teaching about food safety that people don't really take the time to measure the amount of water to bleach proportion, and they'll just pour what they think is a good amount. But look, you only need, for a gallon of water, 2 tablespoons of bleach. You don't need a whole lot, and it does need to sit on the surface for at least a minute before you wipe it dry. Next slide, please. So wash and sanitize your cutting boards, dishes, utensils, and countertops after preparing each food item and before you move on to the next food item in your food preparation day. So you need to wash and sanitize before moving on. Next, please. Consider using paper towels to clean up your kitchen surfaces. If you do use cloth towels, keep them in that sanitizing solution. Remember, pathogens can spread to food if the equipment has not been cleaned and sanitized between uses. Next slide. So let's talk about, you've arrived at your vending stall and you're given a table and a chair. What do? Well, first, you have to have brought with you some type of sanitizing solution, or at least the proper water and bleach to create your sanitizing solution. And you'll need to sanitize your stall before you begin to sell. There should be no pets even in that area. So a pet laying at the chair below while something is being sold really shouldn't be happening. Wash your hands frequently with potable water. And if that's not available, again, you would use your spring water. Use gloves or tools like tongs for handling food. And all taste samples do need to be pre-cut and pre-packaged at home and not at the market, is what Sarah had mentioned in her portion of the presentation. Want to have all your products displayed appropriately. And last, if you are sick, do not handle the food. Next slide. So here's some best practices. Always practice that good hygiene. Washing your hands frequently, washing your hands at the appropriate times. Clean and sanitize your equipment often using that 1 gallon of water to 2 tablespoons of bleach, and keeping that sanitizing solution at the proper level. Follow those food preparation guidelines to avoid cross-contamination. A cutting board for vegetables is left just to cut vegetables on. A cutting board for raw meats is left just for that. And again, no pets in the food preparation area. Next slide. So here's some things to consider. Get the appropriate food safety trainings, and something like Serve Safe and Safe Staff. I offer Safe Staff at our office. It's not on our Eventbrite listing at this time. It does need to be, it's good to be in an in-person class. So once we get back into having those types of classes, you will see that on our Eventbrite listing. But know who to contact for your questions. You can ask myself, you could ask Sarah. Of course, you can ask your questions to FDACS as well, in the University of Florida. Use equipment and utensils that are easy to clean and sanitize. Things, it sounds so easy, but if you are going to be cleaning equipment often and sanitizing often, make sure it's easy for yourself to do. And it's a good idea to keep a sample from each batch in case of a later issue. Of course, liability insurance is encouraged. Practice good food safe handling to minimize contamination. And always check the policy at the farmer's market and what they have to say and how they expect you to have your food prepared and marketed. And of course, if in doubt, discuss with your regulatory agency. Next slide, please. So Safe Staff, if you are interested, it is a food handler certification program. It just provides some essential basic food safety information. It's about a 5 to 6 hour in-person training, and it is taught at our office in Sarasota County. And you do register through Eventbrite, but it is Safe Staff and Serve Safe is also taught through the University of Florida at other counties. So if you don't live in Sarasota, but you live in Florida, you can always go online and find where it will be taught in your area. And of course, you can take the Safe Staff online, and it's available at that website. Next slide, please. And those are my list of resources.
So thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. I know this is a huge amount of information. It's kind of a wall of information. Most of it's confusing, but I'm so glad that you all tuned in to learn more about this, regardless of where you are in your process of starting or thinking about starting a food business. Feel free to reach out anytime. And we're both really good at, if we don't know the answer to something, we'll find you someone who does. So thank you so very much. And you will hear from us via email in a few days.